Thank you. You can all hear me, right?
Yes.
Cool. Thanks very much for showing up, and thanks Awwwards for having me. It's a pretty full house. I think yesterday we were completely packed, so that means that everybody's here is really committed to being here right now. So thank you very much for that. I'll try not to disappoint. So I'm David Vogel. I'm a group user experience director at AKQA Amsterdam, and that's a mouthful. Most of you will probably have heard of AKQA, or hopefully have heard of AKQA. We're an agency. We're all across the world. About 2,000. I never remember the stats completely. We have a lot of offices and a lot of people all around the world, and some really interesting clients. All of you will also know what UX design is, but if I'm at a party and somebody says, "Okay, I'm a hairdresser, I'm a designer, and I'm a group user experience director at AKQA," there's literally not one word in that sentence that people understand. And I've not really been able to articulate what it is that a UX designer does over the years, also because it changes all the time, but also because it is a little bit hard to explain. It's a little bit like an architect, and it's a little bit like a designer, but at AKQA it's also a very strategic discipline, so you always have to launch into this long explanation as opposed to just say, "I'm a butcher," which is so much more simple. But then I've also started to realize that it's a real blessing. It's really cool to not be able to explain what you do very well, because it gives you certain freedom. It means that you can change your description of what you do from time to time, and you can sort of make it up on the fly a little bit. And I've found that I've done a lot of that over the years, and that's also really useful. I think it was maybe Josh Brewer yesterday. Somebody yesterday made the really good point that user experience design skills sort of tend to go obsolete, and we have to continue to adapt. And I think that is now true, probably more than ever. And I'm going to try and talk a little bit about why that is and how we might deal with it. So we've had this is a pretty old video actually from Microsoft. They have done a number of these future vision videos, and I'm really impressed with all of them because they're I don't remember how old this one is, but it's multiple years old, and it looks very it's very prescient. You know, it really is. The aesthetic is very. It really came true in many ways. But at the same time, what's interesting about it is that it's really about pieces of glass. You know, there are different pieces of glass from what we're used to. They're not necessarily all laptops and mobiles, but it's very glass-based. It's very visual. And UX used to be really about sort of wireframes and taxonomies. I mean, we still make some wireframes, but hopefully not too many anymore. And we still need to understand taxonomies, but it's not. Information architecture is no longer the core of what a lot of UX designers do. We got service design and design thinking into the mix a few years ago, and that became really hip, and it's still hip. And as we saw yesterday, a lot of these design thinking agencies have now been bought by bigger corporations to internalize that thinking. That was Josh Brewer who talked about that. And then we got behavioral science, neurology, more of an understanding of the subconscious behaviors that people have, and also the way the brain works, and how that influences our behavior, and then for us, in turn, how do we understand that behavior to be able to influence it or to anticipate it. So UX design has really always been about this idea of having a dumb machine at one end and a smart user on the other. But that paradigm is really changing. It's not that we're becoming dumb, but the machine is becoming smart. And there are a lot of other changes as well. So we're no longer designing for these pieces of glass. The first change is the interface. Our input mechanisms are changing. Is there anybody who hasn't seen this film? 2 people haven't seen this film. Okay, it's really worth watching. It's Her. And it's about a near future, and what's really cool about this, if you work in digital, is that it's a very credible version of what that future might look like, how we might interact with technology. And it's basically all through voice. It's just talking to your machine and your machine talking back to you. And this scene in particular has all these people talking seemingly to themselves. It's a little bit like when we all used to walk around in real life with these things on our head, like Bluetooth, these ridiculous Bluetooth things in your ear. And for me personally, I saw this and first it felt a little bit incredible, all these people talking to themselves. But actually it's not a million miles away from everybody looking at their phone screen. And actually now I think it's probably really prescient, and it's probably really, that is probably very much like the reality in a few years' time. The aesthetics in the film are also really cool, this kind of craft, fake craft, so it's these handwritten letters that are actually written by a machine. So this blurring of what people do and what machines do, I think is really beautifully expressed in this film. And it's not just the idea of voice technology and interacting with the machine through voice, but there are other input mechanisms that we're discovering. Everybody already knows Xbox and Xbox Kinect. A few years ago, that was like, I remember when those first videos came out, it was called something else then. It wasn't Kinect yet. And you could move your body and the computer would respond and recognize that, and that was really awesome. And already we're now, at AKQA, we're doing a project for Intel, who've basically taken that same technology and shrunk it and put it in a laptop, so you can gesture to your laptop and have that same interaction patterns. And what you see here in the background is probably also familiar to a lot of people, Project Soli by Google, and they've shrunk that technology down to the size of a chip this big, and it's basically radar technology. So you can interact in the air, and you can just use virtual controls that are modeled on real-world controls, but they're in the air, and you can control machines like that. It's still in the experimental phase, just in the same way that Kinect was a little while ago. So some version of this technology is coming up very soon, and we have to think about, okay, how do we design for that? It's almost going back to these. I forgot the name now. Well, it doesn't matter. Apple used to be famous for, can somebody help me out? What is it called when a button looks like a button and a wooden thing looks like a wooden thing? Skeuomorphic, thank you. So those principles, those skeuomorphic principles, in a different way are coming back again with this type of technology, because it's an analog, it's mimicking an analog interface. So another interesting new way of interacting with machines is brain control. This is emotive. I think it's it's in a very early phase. What's cool is that after the military industry, they obviously are always the first to really leverage technology, and also that's where a lot of the investment comes from, which maybe isn't so nice to think about, but a lot of our technology comes from thinking about how we can kill as many people as we possibly can. But after the military industry, the toy industry are actually really at the forefront of adopting technology. They do a lot of testing, and it's interesting because of course, their audience are children, and they're very critical. They don't have any preconceptions. You can't hype technology to children in the same way that you can to adults, so you get some really interesting direct feedback. There are, for instance, toys that have quite sophisticated emotion or artificial intelligence inside them, like teddy bears that talk back, and they talk back to you differently if you're a 3-year-old than if you're a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old. So they're quite advanced in thinking about how to use technology. There are also toys that use brain control. I think there's a Star Wars toy that uses brain control. So the toy industry is already playing around with this, and in some way, I mean, obviously we're not going to be walking around with these big things on our head anytime soon, but in some capacity, these types of interfaces are coming up. Again, what do we do with that? Of course, the medium is changing. So we've had some really interesting talks yesterday already on VR, and VR, to me personally, is incredibly fascinating. And one of the reasons why it's fascinating, we saw that yesterday as well, is because we don't really understand yet what's going to happen. If you've had one of those things on your head, and as I'm sure many of you have, you know how incredibly immersive it is. It's absolutely a new experience. I remember the first time I had to have one, and it was that early demo, the Oculus Rift demo with the roller coaster, and they told me to sit down on a stool because otherwise you just fall over. And you have this thing on your head, and you feel it in your stomach. You know, it's very physical because your body really is so primed to respond to what you see. We're such visual people or visual beings that if you see something and if you're placed in a situation, then your whole body starts to feel like you're actually in that situation, just because it's so immersive on your head, and you can see that in this video as well. I saw a guy called Chris Milk speak last year, and he's the head of Verse. He's a VR filmmaker. He's done a lot in that space. He was one of the early people, and Verse is one of the early companies who are very active in VR. He was also responsible for this documentary in a Syrian refugee camp, where you actually you're placed in that position of being a refugee and walking through the camp. He called VR an empathy machine, which I think is a really interesting way to think about it, because from the book all the way up to VR, we've gotten nearer and nearer to experiencing what somebody else experiences, and that is what empathy is all about. So this idea that you can really be put in the position of another person and feel what they feel, I think has massive implications for how we interact as a species. And again, for us as UX designers, we have to think about what are the implications for us. How do we design for that type of medium? It's really interesting. The machine, as I said, used to be dumb, and it's becoming increasingly smart. I won't say it's come of age yet. Somebody yesterday said it's in its awkward teenage years in a different context, but I thought it was a good description of this. It's starting to manifest itself for the first time. I think some of the videos in here, also this one, iRobot, we've always thought of artificial intelligence either as a sort of a god, very benevolent god, or a threat, something very scary, something that sits outside ourselves and is smarter than us. Maybe that'll happen at some point, I don't know, maybe it won't. Right now, certainly, artificial intelligence isn't like a being. It doesn't have agency. It doesn't have feelings yet. So Kevin Kelly called what we have at the moment artificial smartness, which I think is a really interesting description of it. It basically, it's almost like those exoskeletons for the brain. You know, it allows us to become much better at what we are already good at. And we all know this already, because if you use Google Maps to walk around Paris or something, if you're not from Paris, or if you use LinkedIn to look at somebody's profile, this idea that we augment our own intelligence and our own wayfinding capacity or our social capabilities is already very much part of our culture. We don't really think about it anymore. But the big difference is that we always used to have to go and look for that information, and now that information is coming to us, and artificial intelligence is one of the things that allows that to happen. So we have new technologies or new services like M from Microsoft, Siri, Nest, these systems that basically anticipate our behavior and almost nudge us in the right direction, or provide just the right type and the right amount of data when we need it. And again, that needs to be thought up somehow. We can't just leave it to the machine. We have to play a role in that interaction. So the last thing is that the relationship that we have with the machine used to be very much through computers and smaller computers like mobiles, but it's now going to come through lots of other connected devices. The Internet of Things has been around as a term, has been around for so long that a lot of people have become very skeptical about it. And I remember the same used to apply to mobile. There have been these mobile evangelists who for years have been saying whatever 2012 is the year of mobile, and 2013 is the year of mobile, and 2014. And at some point, we were actually in that reality. It never was really the year of mobile, but the reality is now that mobile is pervasive. And there are a couple of things that made that happen. The main one obviously being the iPhone, the invention of the iPhone, which suddenly made mobile make sense to a lot of people, and that sort of drove adoption. I think for the Internet of Things, at the face of it, it's still very useless, you could say. There are very few really cool applications of the Internet of Things. And it used to be a little bit like that on mobile as well. So it's easy to think Internet of Things is a bit bullshitty. But I think there's one thing that really will drive the adoption of the Internet of Things, or the emergence of the Internet of Things in the same way that has happened to mobile. And that is really Moore's Law, which is more about computer chips, but actually applies to every aspect of computing and technology, in that basically the price gets driven down and down and down, and the capabilities go up and up and up. And so there's going to come a point in the very near future where it's pretty much as expensive to produce a product without a chip in it as it is to produce that same product with a chip in it. And when that becomes ubiquitous, then all of a sudden, maybe it's no longer about this one device with a digital layer on top, but it's more about all these devices together that create interesting new possibilities. So in my view, the Internet of Things and everything that it promises is an inevitability, and it's also coming very soon because the prices are going down and down and down. These chips are already, at the level of cents. And we already see at AKQA that we're already developing solutions that, for instance, take into account mass adoption of RFID for some of our clients. So it's coming, and it's coming soon, and we have to think about what that means for us. So really all these things, I try to list all the different ways in which the way that we as UX designers think about our craft is under the influence of a lot of new emerging technologies and things that happen in society, and we have to think about what does that mean for us. So, rewind back about 20 years, a little over 20 years even, when I was young or younger than I am now. I went backpacking, which is amazing. Everybody should do that. Everybody, it's almost more important than going to university, I think. But anyway, I went to Australia, New Zealand, Asia, traveled around for a year, did lots of interesting stuff. This is so long ago that it was actually before the internet existed at all, or probably somewhere in a lab, but it wasn't a thing. There was no Kindle, there was no computers, or no connected computers. So I had to, and I still wanted to read because I've always liked to read. But with a backpack that weighs 15 kilos doesn't sound like a lot, but if you have to carry it around, it's ridiculously heavy. So you can't bring all your books. So what happens is you have these backpacker hostels that you stay in, and they're full of books, and if you finish your book, you leave it behind, you grab another one. And in that way, I came across this book, Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by Robert M. Pirsig. I think a lot of you will at least know of this book, and a lot of you will have read this book. My copy actually looked, I mean, it was this edition. I found this online because I lost it again. I gave it to somebody else, never got it back. But it looked even worse than this copy. It was completely torn up, the back cover was missing, it was really, really bad state, which is really cool, right? It's really great if you have a book that's been read by a couple of hundred people before you, and you understand that people have really taken this book to bed with them, carried it around in their bag. It's been lived, and it is really it's a great book. I can really recommend it. The guy who wrote it, Robert Pirsig, is a really interesting character, very precocious and highly intelligent child, went to university at a ridiculous early age, and ran really quickly into the limitations of scientific thought, and basically started to work through that and started to come up with answers, and went mad, went insane. So he went to a psychiatric hospital. This was in the, I think, 60s, 70s. Had electroconvulsive therapy, where they, shoot electrodes, attach electrodes to your brain, not for brain manipulation, but actually to push electricity through your brain to make it better again. In his case, it helped. He got out. He wrote this book. And then followed it up with another book which further expanded on his theory. And the book is about it's like a philosophical scientific novel, and it really deals with the tension between these two words, holism and reductionism. And holism, to remind you, is the idea that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, so that the whole comes ontologically first, and the parts are literally a part of the whole, and the whole the part should be understood through the understanding of the whole. And then, if you turn that on its head and say, if I understand each individual component, then that can help me understand the whole, you're basically looking at things from a reductionist perspective. So you could say that the holistic view, you try to explain the parts through the whole, and in the reductionistic view, you try to explain the whole through the parts. That's the simplest way to think about it. And this goes back many years to you could say the founding fathers of Western intellectual thought. These guys were both students of Socrates, and Socrates arguably was very close to what Pirsig wanted to get to. But the problem with Socrates was that he didn't write anything down. He was the first real philosopher, but he actually lived his philosophy. So philosophy in those days was really concerned with morality. Morality was in a way the Greek way of talking about what is true and what is good and what is real. So Socrates was arguably very close to a very rounded understanding of morality. But he didn't write anything down, he just lived it. So it was up to Plato, his first student, and then later Aristotle, who was Plato's student, to try and put all that into words. And Plato put that into words from a holistic perspective. So Plato wrote The Republic, which is about the ideal society. And so he had this idea of the good as a construct, an indivisible construct, something that is real and that exists almost outside of us and that we can strive for. Whereas Aristotle, he was basically one of the first biologists. He loved taxonomies. He did a lot of creating of collections and so forth. So he understood the world through breaking it down into its component parts and then understanding each of those component parts and then constructing a reality from that. And Pirsig argues really eloquently that this battle, if you like, between these two ways of thinking about it has really stood at the basis of scientific thought, philosophy, but also science. And it's irreconcilable and unresolvable, and that also, I think, drove him and the way Pirsig tried to figure that out, to madness. And that's I can kind of understand that, because there is something very frustrating about trying to connect with either or both of these ways of thinking at the same time. So Pirsig came up with a third idea, which he called quality. And quality is more closely related to Eastern scientific and philosophical thought. And he tried to reconcile those Eastern and Western worlds through introducing this notion of quality. Quality, he says, it can't really be defined, because Pirsig says it precedes and supersedes intellectual construction of it, which is a very complicated way of saying you can't really describe it, but you can live it. He says quality exists at the knife edge of experience, and so it means that everybody can attain it. Everybody can, in fact, understand it and get close to it and go after it. He says it's the fundamental force, I need to read this off my notes, the fundamental force in the universe stimulating everything from atoms to animals to evolve and incorporate ever greater levels of quality. It's a really interesting way of thinking about it as something that innately drives the emergence of bigger and better versions of whatever came before it. So, if you think about quality, and if you bring those notions back to where we started from, this idea of how do we deal with all these different ways in which we have to define the relationship between machine and man and woman, then these three notions are really interesting to me. I think, for instance, when you think about artificial intelligence and designing artificial intelligence, you really can't talk about trying to define it anymore. You can't annotate artificial intelligence. You can't write it up and say, if this happens, then this should happen, and if that happens, that should happen. That's the whole point of that kind of organic way of back and forth. So you become much more like a choreographer. It becomes much more like a ballet. There's some independence in the execution, but at the same time, you still have to set out the lines, and you have to create the narrative. There's a new discipline now, or at least there's a new person who's called artificial intelligence interaction designer, I think. It's Anna Kelsey, she's called, and she works at X.AI. And she studied folklore mythology and directed theater. And she said the whole idea of creating a character and thinking very technically about the way specific words or groupings of words can make people react and respond is something I thought about all the time in college. So here's an example of somebody who works normally as an interaction designer, and her background is not at all in taxonomical thinking. It's in storytelling, and it's in character creation, and it's in understanding the relationships between words and meaning and interaction and behavior. So the fact that somebody with a background like that is now employed to really create the first instances of artificial intelligence, because AI now is primarily used for basically for low-level communication between humans and services, or humans and computers. AI or X.AI make basically, you could say, chatbots, or systems that take the first line of interaction between people and a brand or a company. So that's kind of cool, the way those disciplines feed into our discipline. I think what it boils down to is that modern digital experiences, whether we're talking about ecosystems or omnichannel shopping, or services that enhance physical products, or even Internet of Things like machine-to-machine communication, I think 80% of that probably happens without really involving a human at all. There's a lot of chatter between machines, and ultimately that should be to the benefit of the user, but it's not really about the interaction between the user and the machine in the traditional sense. So what all these things have in common is that they've become too complex to really describe in detail. And so I think these notions that Pirsig introduces in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance are really can help us grab a hold of that complexity. So to make that a little bit more concrete, some of the deliverables that we've created at AKQA include what we call an experience flow. And an experience flow really is really about these three components. So across the top, and this is not an unfamiliar way of describing experiences to a lot of you, but across the top you basically consider the experience from a holistic perspective. What is the thing that we're trying to do? What is the overall experience from beginning to end? And how can we condense that into something that makes it really easy to understand what the point of this whole thing is? And then going down, you have the reductionist part. So we look at the tasks that people have to perform at each of these steps, and we look at the behaviors. Adaptive Path had something similar, and it was this doing thinking approach. We've kind of evolved this idea of thinking a little bit from sort of an internal narrative into more a description of behavior, and a description, because a lot of behavior is subconscious and maybe irrational even. So we try to anticipate that irrationality and that behavior, and we try to describe that here. And you can see the ebb and flow of engagement and of emotion that we try to map there. So the emotional ingredients and the rational ingredients are both key to understanding how that holistic experience can be expressed in functionality. And then we turn that into a prototype. So from here to there is actually one step. We go straight from that explanation to something that we can start to feel, because that's where the quality sits. That's the knife edge of experience, right? Because just putting things in a logical flow and then looking at the components doesn't necessarily get you to a great product. The quality, that ungraspable, undefinable element, is what brings it to life. It's almost what makes it better and better. And the nice thing about these kinds of deliverables is that it really helps with the client relationship as well. So if we always start doing this together with client. And interestingly, some clients come to you with a very reductionist way of looking at their problem. They basically have already written a list of functionalities that they want you to build. And that's very unhelpful, because having a big Excel sheet with functionality doesn't really get you to a really good and interesting user experience. And similarly, some clients just tell you the end result. It needs to be something like this. And so these types of deliverables can really help us for those people or clients, or whether it's internal people or clients, who really think about the holistic aspect. It helps force the reductionistic thinking in there. Okay, what are the components of that overall experience? And people who come from a very reductionistic perspective, you can force them to think about the overall experience through quality. And again, you see the line, the ebb and flow of emotion in here. And then we have additional deliverables that take that even further. So we could go further out and we go further in. This is some examples of ecosystem maps that we use to go further out, because even if we're asked to build something like an app or a specific website or a service, we always have to pull out and look at the context of that, because an experience flow allows you to map one type of experience, but that experience always takes place in a context, and actually that experience, more than often than not, is very fragmented and random. The way people interact with brands through digital is very unpredictable. There are multiple user journeys, there are multiple states, multiple types of users, and in order to map all those complex interactions across all these different touch points, you need to have a different type of deliverable, and so that's what we try to do with ecosystem maps. And also we go deeper into the reductionistic element. So after we've done an experience flow, we do something called story mapping, which is actually something that we stole from somewhere else. We do a lot of stealing, begging, and borrowing, which I think is key to being a smart UX designer. You shouldn't be too precious. Just, if you see something cool, interesting, use it. Anyway, that's by the way. Story mapping is a way to use something very similar like an experience flow across the top. That's the spine, so that's the spine of the experience, and then you can go really deep into the ribs, the individual ribs, and define all of the different types or the different versions of that task that sits at the top. So that allows you to get much deeper in and understand the parts more, but you still have the whole to contextualize those parts. And then, how do we get to quality? How do we safeguard quality? If quality is the thing that makes that whole thing sing, then we need to understand really quickly whether that quality is there. So prototyping is key, and not just prototyping as in making a clickable prototype, but prototyping in every single way. Quickly sketching things, using After Effects to look at micro interactions and animations. All of that is key to understanding whether the quality is there. And you can take that one step further as well and say, it's not just about creating prototypes and testing those, but actually if you create a product, you need to allow for that product to have lots of life cycles. So you need to have multiple releases, you need to develop agile, so that you can judge the value of your work in the context of the use of it. So being able to do this over multiple releases is key. So we take actually those three concepts of holistic thought, reductionistic thought, and quality from our earliest deliverables all the way through to post-launch. And I noticed a very interesting similarity between something we say at AKQA. We strive for the imaginative application of art and science to create beautiful ideas, products, and services. And Persig said, quality is the Buddha. Quality is scientific reality. Quality is the goal of art. Thank you.